What are the stories of impact and ingenuity that are transforming our cities? Join us on the Urban Q, where we talk about tackling urban conundrums and celebrate stories, ideas, and people that help us create better cities for all. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Urban Q. Today, I have with me Mridula Ramesh. Mridula is the award-winning author of two books, The Climate Solution and Watershed, and the founder of Sundaram Climate Institute, which focuses on water and waste solutions. She's an active climate tech angel investor with a portfolio of over 30 startups and is involved with several initiatives to spur climate tech entrepreneurship. Mridula is the executive director of Sundaram Textiles. The company was amongst the first textiles company globally to win the coveted TPM Excellence Award. She is part of the board of the trustees of WRI-India and is the former chairperson of NIT Andhra Pradesh. She frequently pens columns on climate in the Hindustan Times and the Times of India. Welcome, Mridula, and thank you for joining us on our podcast, The Urban Q.
Thank you, Jaya, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Mridula, I'm going to start with a question that I ask all our guests. And in your case, you have extensive experience with understanding and addressing climate change, specifically water, and it makes me curious, which is your most favorite city and why?
Okay, so I'm going to go with an unconventional choice, which is Hampi. Hampi was a city that existed in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. Okay, and why that's really important is the climate was changing then as now. Right? So there is a lot of parallels that we can draw from the 14th century because world over, empires were crumbling because they were facing the onslaught of climate, which they couldn't cope with. Cambodia was suffering, China was suffering. Europe had one of its largest famines, and that created the situation that made it ripe for plague to attack, right? And in that kind of a situation, a turbulent climate, there was a city that was coming. And what did they do to make them rise? It all had to do with water, right? They understood their rainfall. They understood that if they had to build an army and create security, they needed to tap water. But as they stood, the high ground meant that the river was running, a couple of 100 feet below them. There was no steam engines or motors at that time. The only force they could leverage was gravity. So they chose a spot, 20 kilometers away, and they built canals hugging the contours of the landscape, and then built a bridge like the Roman aqueducts, and then just transported the water. And, over the next couple of centuries, that was just one of their striking water investments. They created cascading tanks, they had tanks for settling the silt. They understood it really well. And what that allowed them to do was to redefine the subcontinent's history, because the entire peninsular India's history just went on a different trajectory because this kingdom came out of nowhere and just in a very dry land, right? There was nobody else who could come up there because it was dry. That also made them, protect themselves from invaders. And it was all about water.
That is just fascinating. And I don't think a lot of people know about this. So many things to learn from Hampi. But, if you come to a modern city, and I'll ask you this then, that which modern city do you think has made the most innovative pivot in response to climate challenges like Hampi did back in the day?
So I think a common favorite is Singapore. I think they seized of their problem fairly early. I've gone through the Singapore case study in my second book. And what they did is, as early as the 1970s and 80s, they started thinking of this. So they set it up at the highest priority. And they very early on said, what, we want to attract the highest talent. So they paid market wages for some of their bureaucrats leading it, created a competitive process. And they said, we can harness this amount of water. We can do all of this. But in the 90s, what happened is sewage treatment technologies had reached a kind of stage wherein it was ripe for implementation. But something I learned while talking to several bureaucrats there is because they set their water price high enough, they could afford to both experiment and invest in technology, which saves money for the citizens over the long term, right? So they retreat all of their sewage, and that becomes new water. And they also take their, school children have to go mandatorily to a kind of park where they're introduced to all of this, saying it's new water, it's great water, and they just blend it into their system. So it's there from get-go. When you look at solid waste, Swachh Bharat has been a reset, but I think anyone walking around many Indian cities today will feel quite disheartened because there are piles of garbage. There is a lot of garbage burning. But one city who just came out of nowhere and said, "I can fix this," was Indore, and they were as bad as their fellow cities. And then over a course of a year or a little more, they fixed it. But how did they do it? They worked with civil society, right? They said everyone pays and there'll be carrot and stick rewards. They involved more than 800 self-help groups.
Fantastic. And I think the common thread that I caught on to in both your examples was payments, and we'll come to that later. One thing is, a lot of city level climate action in India, at least, it remains nascent, not just in India and most part of the world. In India, only a handful of cities have rolled out climate action plans in just the last few years. And more often than not, climate action is treated as an afterthought, right? It's like, oh, and by the way, climate action. And many believe that it's just going to cost much more additional time, money. It's a transition which is impossible to do in many ways. So, what can policymakers do to mainstream climate resilience into sort of the urban development that we see around us?
See, here I am actually coming on the side of policymakers. I do feel sorry for them, right? I think when it comes to climate, it's not a burning issue. I mean, LA accepted. I think what I've seen, and I'm paraphrasing somebody else's quote, is that support for climate change is a mile wide, but an inch deep. And what that means is that's the issue that gives way when anything else comes in. Right? And so what policymakers, in my experience, what has worked is to focus on jobs, right? So when you look at climate action, sometimes don't even call it climate action. And in today's day and age, that may not necessarily be a bad thing. You don't need to call it climate action. Call climate by any other name, it will still be as hot. So you can focus on the kind of jobs that come in, core benefits in literature. Health is something that always resonates with the public. If you focus on jobs and health, I think a lot of the things will be easier to push through.
That's super interesting that talk about the co-benefits, right? And that's a very necessary angle that most people and most sort of the scientific community around this problem tends to ignore a little bit, which is why it probably doesn't get the attention and the mile wide, inch deep, attention to it. Let's talk about water a little bit more, right? And your book, Watershed, highlights India's deepening water crisis and raises concerns that by 2030, the country won't be able to meet half its water demand. That's significant. So, from your perspective, what are the biggest policy blind spots when it comes to managing urban water systems sustainably?
So, when I look at constraints, I look at three constraints, right? The first is if you want to provide water, it costs money. I mean, the investments cost money. And if you look through the balance sheets or the finances of urban municipalities or, the Nagar Panchayats or any of them, it's not appetizing, right? As an investor, I wouldn't, it's scary, right? You won't put money there. And we're caught in a chicken and egg problem. We have a problem, people won't pay for it, the problem gets worse, etc. So we went and asked, would you actually pay for water? So Sundaram Climate Institute has done this study where we went and talked to a vulnerable set of the population. We talked to 2,389 households over 6 years. And we asked them a simple question. We said, amongst other questions, we said, would you pay for good quality water if it came 24/7 to your household? 63% said no. So, clearly there is education required there. and in terms of what people are grappling with. That's as far as bureaucracy is concerned. But when you come to policy, politics and policy is framed by politicians and implemented by them. We asked people during an El Nino, would you vote on water? And keep in mind, many of these people were getting water once in 3 days, once in 4 days, sometimes once a week, sometimes not at all. And we asked 930 odd people that question, 600 plus gave us an answer. And long story short, most people said no, water would not influence their vote. So during a crisis, if people won't vote on water, to take LA, when LA is burning, if people say they won't vote on fire protection, it gives you a parallel, right? So I think there is a lot of education handholding required. But the silver lining is it's iffy as a silver lining, but that's how things are here. We asked people, do you buy water? Okay, and again, keep in mind, this is an economically vulnerable segment. 43% bought water, and they spent on average 450 rupees plus or minus 30 rupees per month. And this is not all the time. They typically bought water in El Nino years and in the summer. But it's almost like an El Nino tax on the poorest groups of our population. And it's a very regressive tax. And I think this sort of gives you an outline of some of the bottlenecks that policymakers have to contend with while moving forward. The good news is, people have done it. So there is hope there.
So I would like to learn more about, what people have done there. So just carrying that forward, and we need more robust management of our water systems to kind of mitigate long-term environmental impacts, but also to get out of this conundrum of this climate plus ecosystem plus people sort of, that space that we're in. What practical steps would you suggest can urban areas take to build water resilient, climate resilient water infrastructure? Do you have any examples you were just mentioning?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, let's go back to Hampi. So what did Hampi do? They did those cascading tanks. And I think, a lot of the Indian cities today have those cascading tanks built during that era or even earlier. So the Silapadigaram, which is about almost 2000 years old, talks about these tanks. So, I mean, this has been around for a long time. Our, ancient Indians knew that their water was highly variable. So, if you get water, I went to a lecture, I think, where a senior water scientist was saying that India gets most of its water in 100 hours. So if it's that seasonal and you use water every day, the one thing that can help you is storage. And we've done pretty poorly on that.
Right.
So, but we still have some, right? So the one very practical step is, and I think India has gotten it, right? We've finally got our water body census. Protect your water bodies. It's probably the best thing you can do. And going back to my analogy of, people spending 450 rupees a month, we found that people who lived next to a functional water body, that spend came down. Okay, it varied, but on average 100 rupees a month. So, there is that tangibility. People are not making the connection, but I think this is something very practical to do. Cities have started doing it, but it's a practical, easy win, and you can do it in a way that generates livelihoods. So one thing that Sundaram Climate Institute came up with was a sort of construct called tank tourism, right? We said in ancient, not even ancient, even in many rural communities today, the tank provides livelihood. It provides irrigation, it provides fishing. People sell lotuses that grow on the tanks to earn money. The livestock use the water, so it supports the incomes in many ways. But urban tanks are completely severed from their neighborhood. Right. So how can we rebuild the connection? And one way we came up with is tank tourism. Give, just basic infrastructure, walking track, a cycling track, selfie spots, Wi-Fi hotspots, performance spaces. And we found that there were tanks that could generate 50 jobs, 100 livelihoods. It depends on the tank and the kind of infrastructure you provide. But then, once you have 50 jobs, depending on a tank, apart from the water in the tank, those 50 people are going to fight if there are encroachments coming in, right? So
Oh, that's beautiful. I like this idea of tank tourism, and quite honestly, I hadn't heard of it so far. So, how you can create that connect between people and the natural environment and resources in such a way that they start to sort of value it, and it becomes more visible, that connection. So, you emphasize that tackling climate change requires a shift in how people live and consume resources. The example about people living next to a water body, etc. And I know that your home in Madurai generates almost no waste and is an experiment in coexisting with the environment. So tell us more about your home. How can other homeowners and people who want to adapt climate friendly behaviors, especially in high growth aspirational urban areas, how can they move towards more climate friendly actions?
okay, so the first and most important thing I'm going to say is never rely on conscience. As a mother of two teenagers, it doesn't work, right? I think when you have to get the kids to school, you have to run to office, you have to host a party, whatever. Um, Waste is going to go out of the, you know, just it's not going to happen. So I think what really needs to focus on is design. And that's what we did in our house. And I've gone through like almost a step by step of what to do in my first book for those who are interested. But broadly, there was no conscience involved at all. Actually, the TPM practices that we did in the factory is what came to apply at home.
Hmm.
So we did something called pokeyoke. Pokeyoke in Japan, you can think of it as error proofing or idiot proofing, whichever. They both work interchangeably. And what we did is we measured. So we saw where we mapped our waste, which rooms, where is the wet waste coming from, dry waste. If most households are like ours, most of the wet waste gets generated in the kitchen. Then we said, why is it coming? Right? Again, this is very, I mean, if I have to get technical, it's called sources of contamination in the TPM terminology. So where does the waste come from? Why does it come? And what we found is two things. People were storing things out of eye range or in covered containers. So many times they didn't know what they had, so things rotted.
Hmm.
The other thing when it comes to segregation, and this is key, you cannot take any additional time to segregate. If you do, you've lost the battle.
Right.
So one thing, the biggest innovation for us was dustbins with no lids.
Hmm.
So it takes no additional time. When you're unwrapping something, the dry bin is right there and the wet bin is right here.
Right.
And we've done it for now 8 years. So I think it's working pretty okay. And we manage between 95 to 98% of our waste at home. So it's not as though we don't generate waste. We do. That's just life. We brought down the amount of food waste by half,
Hmm.
all the storing in transparent containers, eye level and all that. But we still, there is vegetable peels. There is some rotten food. It's part of life. So the question is management. So we have a biogas plant at home. We have a compost pit at home. And the key here, again, no conscience, can't smell.
Hmm.
Okay? It can't be yucky. I think, let's leave aside the coir of the converted. If you want it to be effective, you need to reach all the people who hate climate, who hate sustainability, etc. So it can't stink. It can't be yucky. And it's possible to do that through design. My only point here is think of design, gather the data, and please don't rely on conscience.
No, that is fabulous because I think, when we think about behavior change, we think about inducing people to do things that they may not like, right? So I like the point that here you're not causing additional burden. You're not, creating more time needed for some of these activities. And yet through design, how can you change systems so that, things flow on their own? I also like the point about, connecting the why of the food, sort of the wet waste and, the segregated waste to now let's reduce food waste. So I think those are important things. And when you visualize it, when you look at that stuff, in front of you versus in covered bins, that's an amazing point. So let's talk about innovation, Mridula. That's your other sort of pet area that you've focused on a lot. And it's almost been a decade since you founded Sundaram Climate Institute. centered on two pillars: zero waste, zero water. And you've supported practices and technologies that don't generate waste and reduce water consumption to almost zero. So, what kind of urban solutions, including those coming from startups, do you think have the greatest potential to kind of scale and transform cities?
So when, I got into this because we ran out of water at home, right? And when we came to ask why are we running out of water at home, we have no clue where we were using our water. We had like a educated guess because we had no metering in our house.
Mm.
The first step towards solving things, which is put meters, right? We have 15 meters in our house because now we know, like, it's an old house, so things will leak from time to time. But because of those 15 meters, if there is a leak, I find out in a day.
Yeah.
Whereas in other places, you can't find out for a long time. So that's one thing. So there are startups around metering, several, Earth Focus is one example, but there are several others also. I think anything to do with metering, making your water views visible, is something I would look at. For us, reusing a lot of our reject water was the game changer in becoming water resilient. We have, I think, 3 or 4 qualities of water, depending on the month, that we use in our house, right? It's not very difficult to do. It sounds difficult. It's not. Basic plumber will do it.
Right.
But knowing that you don't need the same quality for every kind of use is a game changer. So startups that give you recycled water, for instance, again, there are several. That's the second thing, because let's keep in mind that even though a lot of on-paper regulation exists to treat and reuse sewage water, they don't work in practice, okay, because it's a tick mark and not something that can work over time. So in our factories, for instance, our sewage water is our beloved friend, right? It's what waters the crops. It's what waters we have like a semi-forest in one of the factories. So it's really useful and it has a lot of nutrients, right? So it's great. The third thing is any waste management companies. You do need hand-holding, collecting the data, hand-holding, telling you this, that. One underspoken thing, and this is really close to my heart. I mean, if you talk of like evil in our country, it's, I think, the condition of waste pickers, right? They manage most of our waste for us and they live in horrible conditions and they're just invisibilized, right? So when we actually launched our waste report, we did a art exhibition of waste pickers. And it's, I think, anything that can get them into into a recognized formal part of the solution, which several startups are doing, I think that's a winner, both from from the heart and the head.
So that's interesting. And if you were to kind of get back into your investor hat, because you support a lot of these startups, in terms of the startups, right, what are the 3 most critical factors for startups to develop scalable, transformative urban solutions? Because we do see that a lot of these, they're coming up with good intention, with really good solutions, but scaling is an issue. And sort of replicability is also an issue. Solutions work in a certain context, may not work in another, especially true for waste. So, what are the critical factors for startups?
I think here we really need to reimagine Indian cities. One Indian city, some of the bigger Indian cities is bigger than in Israel or Singapore. So let's not try to solve the policy at a national level. Focus on Bangalore, let's focus on Bangalore. If you focus on Madurai, let's focus on Madurai, right? I think there you can actually start doing things, because finally, as a startup, what do you need? You need a business model, right? And I think the first thing I would advise a startup to look at is, don't put your financial model in front of your business model. Understand the problem you're trying to solve. So let me give you an example. Certain things are scalable, like with venture funding, it'll do the hockey stick. That's eminently suited for tech. It is not eminently suited for waste management. Many types of waste management. There is a startup I'm working with which deals with cooking oil. They're managing it, but that's because that's the way they've designed their business model. But for most startups, they want the venture model. They want those huge valuations, and they forget about whether or not their problem is suited to that. So
Right.
please put business problem first, finance model behind. It's very important. The second thing is for the funders, right? And I'm speaking to the funders saying, look, there are philanthropic sources of capital, there's government sources of capital, and there's private sources of capital. And in private, there's debt and there's equity, right? All of these are different. And there is one guy or woman who's trying to solve a problem. She's trying to please all of them. And they all don't talk to each other. They just kill the founder, which is a very sad thing to do. So I would kindly request funders to talk amongst themselves. Government talk to philanthropy, talk to venture capital, talk to debt, right? So you come up with a cohesive ask of a founder. And I think that requires funders to be a little more knowledgeable about the problem. And that we have a problem with. A lot of investors are not knowledgeable. So I've heard sort of unreasonable asks in meetings and sort of questions which come for the 100th time, which says, come on, like get a little informed. So first I would say is, you need to put the financial model first. Second is funders need to get together. For the startup entrepreneur themselves, look, it's a tough job. Don't do it if you don't have to.
That's actually a very valuable piece of advice. Don't do it if you don't have to. Passion, grit, it takes a lot to kind of stay in the game. So, absolutely. So, Mridula, coming to the last question of our conversation here, to wrap all of this up, right? So, what is that one bold but necessary policy shift that you think India needs to make to immediately ensure sustainable and resilient urban growth?
I think you need to price water. I know the challenges up against it, but just as LA residents will not question too much on adopting fire safety standards now, the time to do it is right after a crisis, right? I think when Bangalore was going through a time when millionaires were using mall toilets, that's the time to do it, right? Don't take a pan-India price. India's water varies hugely across geography, hugely across time. So what I'm asking for is a seasonal water price, but also a progressive water price. Give a certain quantity of water free, sure, but everything over that you pay for. You can also take a leaf from Israel's book, pay differently for different quality. So people who use sewage, pre-treated sewage, pay much less than pure fresh water. And I think this should work because someone said this, an Indian said this 1700 or so years ago. Chanakya said it. Chanakya said all water belongs to the king and everybody pays taxes, but the rich pay more, right? So I think if you can have a seasonal water price, just as what Chanakya also said, I think if you can have a seasonal water price that varies by geography, and the time to implement it is right after a crisis or even during. And it cannot be done by the government alone. So there is a example, I think Malkapur, which many of the practitioners know about. This is a small village in Maharashtra. It's a politically safe space, and that's very important. So I think in my book, I have a 2x2. Water crisis, yes, no. Politically safe, yes, no. And then what is politically safe and has a water crisis, this is the place to start. Right? And they worked with civil society, with just going house to house, doing show and tell, and they found that many people were actually paying less in buying water because the large users were hiding under the inskirts of the poor, which happens all the time. And a lot of hand-holding, show and tell. The villagers actually went to see where the pipes were made to make sure the quality was okay because I'm paying for it now. And the water consumption just came down, and they became 24/7 water. And I think it's possible, but I think it's not easy.
Not easy, and we're asking for bold steps here. So fantastic, Mridula. That was a truly enlightening, insightful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and all of this vast research which has gone into the books you've written as well. And more power to you and the Sundaram Climate Institute and doing the good work that you're doing. And thank you very much. Look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you, Jaya. WRI does amazing work as well, and pleasure to be asked here. And thank you so much.
Thank you.